There is a building on Jekyll Island, Georgia, that most Americans walk past on their way to the beach. It is a Victorian clubhouse, dark wood, high ceilings, a wraparound porch facing the water. It was built in 1886 as a private resort for the wealthiest men in the United States. Vanderbilts came here, Morgans came here. At any given time, the membership of this club controlled roughly 1/6 of the world's private wealth. The building is still standing. The state of Georgia turned it into a hotel. You can book a room tonight for $249. In November of 1910, 6 men arrived at this building under false names. They had traveled from Hoboken, New Jersey in a private rail car with the blinds drawn. One of them later wrote that they wore hunting clothes as a disguise, so that if anyone saw them boarding together, they would assume it was a hunting party. They stayed for 9 days. No record of that meeting exists in any government archive. No minutes, no agenda, no attendance log. For 25 years, none of the 6 men publicly confirmed the meeting had taken place at all. What those 6 men wrote during those 9 days would be introduced in the United States Congress 3 years later under a different name by a senator who was one of the 6. And the question the official record never answers is this: if what they designed was truly a reform to protect the public from powerful bankers, why did the men who designed it spend 25 years denying they had ever been in the same room together? I found this story because I was following a number, a specific number in the United States Treasury records that does not match the official explanation. The further I went into those records, the congressional testimony, the Senate debates, the private papers now archived at Columbia University, the more the official story fell apart. Not dramatically, quietly, the way a ledger falls apart when the columns simply do not add up. To understand what happened in 1913, you need to understand what the numbers looked like before it. From 1800 to 1912, 112 years, the United States dollar was, by most measures, stable. There were panics, recessions, individual years of volatility, but over the span of a century, the purchasing power of a dollar did not systematically erode. A dollar in 1800 bought roughly what a dollar bought in 1900. The mechanism was simple. The dollar was tied to a fixed weight of gold or silver. The government could not print more money than it had metal to back it. Since 1913, that same dollar has lost 96.7% of its purchasing power. That figure comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis's own inflation calculator, not from a critic of the system, from the system itself. In 1913, the total national debt of the United States was $2.9 billion. By 1919, 6 years later, it was $27.4 billion, an increase of 839%. The official explanation for that increase is the First World War. That explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because the mechanism that made borrowing at that scale possible for the first time was created in December 1913, 8 months before the war began. In 1912 and 1913, a congressional investigation called the Peugeot Committee published findings that shocked the country. It revealed that a small group of private bankers controlled an extraordinary share of American economic life. J.P. Morgan and his associates held 341 directorships across 112 corporations. The combined value, $22.2 billion. The logical response to those findings would have been to reduce the power of those bankers. What Congress passed instead was a law that gave those same bankers permanent institutional authority over the nation's money supply. The question the record does not answer is, how did the men the investigation was targeting end up writing the solution? The answer has been sitting in a library in New York since 1919, and the man who left it there spent 25 years hoping no one would read it. Frank Vanderlip was president of the National City Bank of New York from 1909 to 1919. He was one of the 6 men in that rail car, one of the most powerful private bankers in the United States. In February of 1935, 2,000 years after the trip to Jekyll Island, Vanderlip published a first-person account in the Saturday Evening Post. He wrote, and I am quoting directly from that article, "I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System." And then he explained why it had been kept secret for a quarter century. Again, his exact words, "If it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress." This is not an allegation. This is not a theory. This is the account of a participant, in his own words, published in a major national publication and archived today at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library, available to any researcher who requests the file. Vanderlip did not hide what he had done. He explained it. He explained that the men who designed the Federal Reserve System believed correctly that if Congress knew bankers had written the bill, Congress would not pass it. So they wrote it under false names in a private club and introduced it through a senator who was one of them. Now consider what else happened in 1913. On February the 3rd, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. For the first time in American history, the federal government had the permanent constitutional authority to collect a direct tax on individual income. A man who earned $600 a year as a factory worker in Pittsburgh had no obligation before this date to report that income to any federal authority. After this date, he did. Refusal was a federal offense. On April the 8th, 64 days later, the 17th Amendment was ratified. Before 1913, United States senators were chosen by state legislatures. They were, in effect, the representatives of the states themselves within the federal government. After April the 8th, they were elected by direct popular vote. The states lost their structural voice in the Senate. On December the 23rd, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. 3 structural changes to the architecture of American government: the control of money, the taxation of income, and the representation of states, in 323 days. The Congressional record treats each of these as a separate debate, a separate process, a separate achievement. No official document connects them, no memo, no correspondence, no planning record that treats them as a coordinated effort. That absence is itself a document of a kind. The men in that rail car in November 1910 were Senator Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., A. Piatt Andrews, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's personal secretary, Benjamin Strong, who would become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Paul Warburg, partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and Frank Vanderlip. The bill they produced at Jekyll Island was introduced in Congress as the Aldrich Plan in 1911. It was defeated. The same framework was then repackaged, given new names, new sponsors, and reintroduced as the Glass-Owen Bill, named for Senator Carter Glass and Representative Robert Owen, neither of whom had been at Jekyll Island. That bill passed on December the 23rd, 1913, as the Federal Reserve Act. Senator Aldrich's papers are held at the Library of Congress. Those papers contain correspondence from November 1910. The Jekyll Island meeting is not documented in them. The Pujo Committee report, which named the same men which documented their control of American finance, was published 10 months before the Federal Reserve Act passed. Both documents exist in the same archive system. Neither references the other in any official capacity. In 1913, the average American worker earned approximately $800 a year. His wages were his own business. Within 3 years of 1913, that had changed. The income tax created for the first time in American history a permanent and compulsory record of every working person's earnings. The workers who built the factories, ran the machines, and raised the families that constituted the American economy in 1913 were not consulted about any of the 3 structural changes that year. They did not vote on the 16th Amendment. They did not vote on the Federal Reserve Act. They did not know that 6 men had met in a hunting club in Georgia 3 years earlier to design the system that would govern their money for the next century. By 1919, the national debt had increased by $24.5 billion. The interest on that debt was paid through taxation, through the income tax that had been ratified 10 months before the Federal Reserve Act was signed. The workers who earned $800 a year in 1913 had children. Those children had children, and 110 years later, the purchasing power of a dollar has declined by 96.7%. That loss was not the result of natural economic forces. It was the result of a system that was designed in a private club by men who understood exactly what they were designing and who spent 25 years making sure no one found out. The Jekyll Island Club is a publicly accessible hotel on Jekyll Island, Georgia. The building is a National Historic Landmark. Frank Vanderlip's papers are held at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library, available by appointment. The Peugeot Committee Report, House Report Number 1593, 62nd Congress, is fully digitized and available on HathiTrust Digital Library. It has been publicly accessible since 1913. The Congressional record of December 23, 1913, is available at the Library of Congress. It shows 43 senators present. It shows the vote. It shows every name. The Jekyll Island Club is open for bookings. The Vanderlip papers are open for researchers. The Peugeot report is online, free, readable in an afternoon. And the only thing separating the official story from the documented record is the assumption that those documents have already been read by someone whose job it was to read them.